I am Claire, and if there's one thing the whole world can agree on, it's that my twin sister Julia and I have nothing in common. From a young age I realized that the difference between us wasn't just about personality or interests. It was about how our family treated us. Julia was the pride and joy, the perfect embodiment of everything my parents wanted. And me? I was the troublemaker, the one who always messed things up. At least, according to my mother. My father was a university professor, so serious that it seemed like he had never taken a moment to relax in his life. He was always buried in books, research, and academic lectures. To him, knowledge was everything, and maintaining a proper family image was essential. My mother, on the other hand, was the definition of a traditional homemaker, dedicating her life to keeping the house pristine, from perfectly cooked meals to carefully arranged curtains. She believed that the highest role a woman could fulfill was to be a devoted wife and mother, and Julia was the perfect example of that ideal. While my sister was graceful, charming, and always knew how to please others, I had no interest in the ideals my family held so dearly. I preferred band t-shirts over elegant dresses, sitting in a corner with my headphones in rather than attending the dull networking events my parents hosted. If Julia was the bright sunshine that everyone adored, then I was the untamed wind, always out of place in my own family. Every morning I was dragged into arguments I never wanted to have. "Claire, you are not leaving the house looking like that," my mother sighed in frustration as she saw me coming down the stairs in ripped jeans and an oversized hoodie. I shrugged, deliberately ignoring the disappointment on her face. "Why not? It's comfortable." "Comfortable? Do you ever see Julia dressing like this?" Her tone sharpened. "She always knows how to present herself respectfully." I knew exactly what she meant. Julia was the role model I was supposed to learn from. And as always, my sister never missed a chance to fuel the fire. "Mom's right, Claire." Julia stepped into the kitchen with a smug smile. "It's not that hard to look neat and put together." I clenched my fists, frustration rising in my chest. "Have you ever thought that not everyone wants to live like you?" Julia tilted her head, her eyes filled with condescending sympathy. "I'm just trying to help you. One day you'll understand." I gritted my teeth, swallowing the words I wanted to say. This conversation was so familiar that I could predict every single line my mother and Julia would say next. Nothing ever changed. I was still the misfit, the shadow standing next to the perfect figure my family had created. As usual, my father arrived just in time to end the argument with his cold and authoritative voice. "Claire, go change. I don't want to hear any complaints." I looked straight into his eyes, feeling the weight of his disappointment. He didn't have to yell, his expression alone was enough to make me feel like a failure. In my own home. Like a machine following a programmed order, I turned and went upstairs, changing into something my mother could approve of, wiping off the dark eyeliner I had carefully applied that morning. I didn't argue, because I knew no one would listen. But at that moment a thought flashed through my mind. One day, I would leave. I would live a life where I didn't have to change to please anyone. One day, I would be myself. Dinners in my house were never comfortable. They always felt like disguised family meetings, discussions about Julia's accomplishments, meticulously planned futures, and of course, subtle critiques directed at me. My mother set the roasted meat on the table, the delicious aroma filling the air, but I had no appetite. I already knew how tonight's conversation would go, and, unsurprisingly, my father spoke the moment Julia gracefully placed her utensils down. "Julia has applied for an internship at Sterling and Blake Financial Group, a fantastic opportunity to build her career," my father said proudly. "That's one of the top firms in the field," my mother added, her eyes glowing as she looked at her golden child. "If she gets in, her future will be incredibly promising." I remained silent, cutting a piece of meat on my plate. But of course they wouldn't let me off the hook. "Claire, you should apply too," my father said firmly. I set my knife and fork down, meeting his gaze. "But I don't want to work in finance." "Then what do you want to do?" he asked, skepticism clear in his voice. I opened my mouth to answer but hesitated. The truth was, I wasn't entirely sure. I loved art, music, and writing, but I had never been given the chance to truly explore those passions. And I knew that whatever I said now would be dismissed as impulsive and unrealistic. "I'm still figuring it out," I replied, keeping my tone calm. My father sighed, while my mother placed her hand on the table in disappointment. "Claire, you can't just keep dreaming forever," my mother said gently but firmly. "A stable job is what matters most." "I'm not dreaming," I countered. I just don't want to be forced into something I don't enjoy. This isn't forcing, my father cut in. This is guidance. And if you're smart, you'll understand that what you want isn't always what can become a career. I clenched my fists under the table. I was all too familiar with this way of thinking. My father had always believed there was only one correct path to success, the one Julia was following. Don't tell me you're still hanging around those kids at the cafe. My mother suddenly changed the subject, her eyes filled with scrutiny. Those people aren't the kind of friends you should have. I frowned. I knew exactly who she was referring to. The group of creative, free-spirited people I often met at a local cafe. People who didn't care about the superficial standards my family obsessed over. They're my friends, I stated firmly. The kind of people you need to associate with are those who can help you grow, not drag you down the wrong path, my father said coldly. Julia, who had been silently observing, finally spoke up. Claire, you can't keep going against everything Mom and Dad say. Do you really think doing things your own way is always right? The world out there isn't that easy. I let out a laugh, but there was no humor in my voice. You talk as if you know everything. Julia shrugged. I know what's best for me. And I hope one day you'll understand that too. I looked at my sister, the perfect child, the one who always did everything according to expectations, always receiving love and approval from our parents. I could see the good intentions behind her words, but that didn't make me any less angry. If your definition of what's best is living a life that someone else planned for you, then I don't want it. I stood up, pulled my chair back, and didn't bother continuing dinner. I'm done eating. Claire, sit down right now, my father ordered, but I turned my back and walked away. I heard my mother's helpless sigh, the clinking of silverware against porcelain as Julia continued her meal as if nothing had happened. But I didn't care. Climbing the stairs, I walked straight into my room and shut the door. I turned my music up loud, drowning out the voices from downstairs. I closed my eyes, imagining a world where I didn't have to please anyone. A place where I could freely pursue what truly made me happy. I didn't know what the future would hold, but there was one thing I was certain of. I couldn't live like this forever. One day, I would leave. I would find my own path. And this time, no one would stop me. I never thought my life would change just because I stepped out of my usual routine. That night, I decided to leave all the tension at home behind and go for a walk. I had no destination in mind, I just wanted to breathe in the air of freedom, even if only for a moment. The city at night was still buzzing with neon lights flickering and people moving in every direction. I turned into a narrow alley where there was a cafe I often visited, a place free from judgmental looks and constant reminders of how I was supposed to live the right way. I picked a secluded corner, ordered a black coffee, and let myself get lost in the soft music playing from a small speaker near the counter. And then, I saw him. Brian walked into the cafe with an air of complete freedom, unbothered, unrestricted by any rules. He wore a slightly wrinkled gray button-up, his hands calloused, and his hair slightly messy as if he had just taken off a helmet. But what caught my attention the most was his eyes. Eyes that sparkled with confidence, a touch of recklessness, yet undeniably captivating. He ordered a coffee, then glanced around as if searching for something interesting to observe. I expected his gaze to simply pass over me like dozens of others in the cafe, but it didn't. He stopped, looked at me, and then smiled. A knowing, amused smile. Mind if I sit here? His voice was deep, slightly rough, yet oddly comforting. I looked up, slightly surprised by his directness. Suit yourself. He pulled out a chair and sat down without hesitation. You don't seem like the type to sit alone in a cafe like this. I smirked, stirring my coffee lazily. Oh, and what type do I look like? Brian tilted his head, studying me for a moment before smiling lightly. Someone trying to escape from something. His words made me pause. I didn't think anyone could see through me that quickly. And what about you? I asked, trying to deflect the conversation away from myself. He shrugged. I'm not running away. I'm just enjoying life. What does that mean? Brian leaned back in his chair, his eyes suddenly lighting up with excitement. I'm a welder, but not the boring office job type. I travel all over, working on big projects, sometimes on towering buildings, sometimes on a ship drifting in the middle of the ocean. I love the feeling of freedom, of seeing the world my own way. I stared at him, almost unable to believe that someone could talk about their job with such enthusiasm. To me, work had always been associated with pressure, rigid expectations, and invisible obligations. But Brian was different. He worked not because he was forced to, but because he loved it. "And what about you?" he asked, his eyes still filled with curiosity. I laughed softly, shaking my head. "I don't think I have anything worth telling." Brian raised an eyebrow. "You have the look of someone who wants to go further than where they are now. I'd say you just haven't figured out how yet." I fell silent. No one had ever told me that before. That night we talked for a long time. I told him about the pressures from my family, about constantly being compared to Julia, about feeling like an outsider in my own home. Brian listened. He didn't judge, didn't give meaningless advice, he just listened. Before he left, he pulled out a small piece of paper and quickly scribbled down a phone number. "If you ever want to know what freedom feels like, call me," he said, his eyes glinting playfully. I looked at the paper in my hand, feeling a strange mix of excitement and uncertainty. I didn't call the next day. In fact, I stuffed the note into my pocket and forgot about it for weeks. But that feeling, the sense that another path was waiting for me somewhere out there, never disappeared. Then one day, after a heated argument with my father over refusing an internship at Sterling and Blake, I suddenly remembered Brian. I pulled the note out of my drawer, my fingers tracing the bold numbers written in his strong, confident handwriting. Without hesitating any further, I picked up my phone and dialed. The line rang only once before that familiar deep voice answered. "I figured you'd be ready by now." I took a deep breath. "Maybe." Brian chuckled softly. "Then let's go." I didn't know exactly what I was stepping into, but for the first time in my life I felt like I was no longer trapped. And that feeling was incredible. I knew from the moment I decided to introduce Brian to my family that it wouldn't be easy. But I never expected it to turn into a full-blown storm. Brian picked me up that afternoon while I stood in front of the mirror, debating whether I should ask him to wear something a little less casual. But he remained true to himself. A simple button-up with rolled-up sleeves, slightly faded jeans, and work boots dusted with dirt. He made no effort to impress my family the way they would expect, and honestly, I loved that about him. "Are you nervous?" he asked as I hesitated in front of the door. I sighed and nodded. "My family. They're not like the people you usually meet." Brian smiled lightly, gently touching my hand. "Claire, I don't need them to like me. I just need them to understand that I love you." I wanted to believe that was enough, but when the door opened and I saw the stunned look on my mother's face, I knew this wasn't going to go well. My father was sitting on the sofa, reading the newspaper as usual. Julia sat across from him, looking as flawless as ever. But both of them lifted their heads the moment my mother gasped in shock. "Claire, who is this?" I squeezed Brian's hand, trying to steady myself. "This is Brian. He's my boyfriend." Silence fell over the room, as if I had just spoken something forbidden. My father lowered the newspaper, his eyes scanning Brian from head to toe with a sharp, judgmental gaze. "What do you do for a living?" he asked, his voice calm but piercing. "I'm a welder, working in construction and infrastructure repair," Brian answered straightforwardly without a hint of hesitation. I could see my mother gripping the armrest tightly. Julia remained silent, but I caught the glance she exchanged with my parents, a look I knew all too well. Unacceptable. My father placed the newspaper down on the glass table and let out a long sigh. "Claire, you're joking, right?" I shook my head, my voice firm. "I'm serious. Brian and I love each other." My mother shook her head in disappointment. "Claire, you've always been impulsive, but this time you've gone too far. Someone like him could never be a good choice for your future." Brian tightened his grip on my hand and I could feel the tension in his body. "Someone like me?" Brian raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry, but I believe that honest work and hard labor are nothing to be looked down on. You may work hard, but that doesn't mean you can provide Claire with a proper life," my father said, his voice steady but cutting. "We've invested years into Claire's education, and now she wants to throw it all away for a welder?" I felt heat rush to my face. "Dad, you don't get to decide who is worthy of me." My mother pressed a hand to her forehead, as if she couldn't believe what was happening. Julia still remained silent, but I saw the quiet disdain in her eyes. "You're ruining your life," my mother said, her voice trembling. "Do you really think loving someone like him will make you happy? You'll end up struggling, living in some run-down apartment, worrying about money every single day, when you could have had a comfortable life with a successful husband." I let out a bitter laugh. "Mom, is that comfortable life the one Julia has? Marrying someone you picked, following the path you planned, and playing the role of the perfect wife just to keep up appearances?" "At least your sister has common sense," my father said, his patience wearing thin. "Not like you. Always chasing illusions of freedom without knowing where it will lead you." I looked around the room, the place where I had grown up, the house that had never truly felt like home. Then I turned to Brian, the only person here who didn't try to change me. "I don't need you to accept this," I said, my voice steadier than ever. "But I also don't need to stay here." My mother's head snapped up, startled. "Claire, what are you saying?" "I'm leaving." I turned to Brian, my mind made up. "Let's go." Brian gave my hand a gentle squeeze, as if making sure I was truly ready for this. I nodded. "Claire, if you walk out that door, you are no longer our daughter," my father said, his voice carrying the unwavering authority of a man used to being obeyed. I turned back to look at him, meeting his gaze head-on. "Then I guess I was never really your daughter to begin with." No one stopped me as I stepped through the door. No one called me back. I felt my heart pounding as Brian and I walked away from that house. As the door closed behind me, I knew I had just left behind a life that had been planned out for me, to step into one completely unknown. For the first time, I was choosing for myself. Life with Brian wasn't easy, but not once did I regret my decision. The day we left, we rented a small apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't anything fancy. The walls were a bit worn, the heating was unreliable, and the kitchen was so tiny that two people standing in it felt cramped. But it was ours. For the first time in my life, I was living somewhere where no one dictated who I had to be, what I had to do, or how I had to live. At first, things were tough. Brian continued taking on welding jobs wherever he could, while I found work as a waitress at a small cafe nearby. We made just enough to cover our bills, but there wasn't much left over. Some nights, we ate instant noodles or grilled cheese sandwiches, blasting music to drown out the sound of the old pipes creaking in our apartment. But the most important thing was, we had each other. Every night, after a long day, Brian would pull me into his arms, smiling softly. "We're building something, Claire. Not everyone has the courage to do this." I believed him, and I believed in myself. Brian was never one to settle. He was always looking for ways to improve, to take his skills further. One evening he came home, his eyes shining with excitement. "Claire, I want to try something new. Have you ever heard of underwater welding?" I frowned. "You mean welding underwater? That sounds dangerous." He nodded, but his grin remained. "Yeah, but it's also one of the highest paying trades out there. If I can get certified, we can change our lives." I looked at him, seeing the determination in his eyes. "Then do it," I said. "I'll support you." Brian enrolled in a 6-month training program, balancing work and study. Some days he left before sunrise and didn't return until the city lights were glowing. We had less time together, but I didn't feel distant from him. Instead, I knew we were moving forward. During that time, I didn't just sit idly either. I left my waitress job and secured an administrative position at a small company specializing in mechanical equipment. The job allowed me to learn more about the industry Brian was pursuing, how businesses operated, and what opportunities he could aim for in the future. 6 months later, Brian officially became a certified underwater welder. The day he got his first job offer, with a salary far beyond anything we had ever earned, he ran home, lifted me off the ground, and spun me around in our tiny kitchen. "We did it, Claire!" he exclaimed, his voice filled with excitement. I couldn't stop laughing. I knew this was just the beginning, but it was a promising one. Brian started working on large offshore projects, sometimes being away for weeks at a time. The job was risky, but the pay was enough for us to start considering something that had once seemed impossible: buying our own home. We found a small but cozy house in a seaside town. It had a spacious backyard, just enough for Brian to build a small workshop where he could work on personal projects when he wasn't offshore. I decided to quit my old job and do something I had never considered before: help Brian with his business. I took over managing paperwork, contracts, and financial planning. I had never been interested in business the way my parents wanted me to be, but this felt different. I wasn't being forced into something I didn't want. I was actively contributing to the life that Brian and I were building together. In the evenings, we sat outside on the porch, watching the sun disappear beyond the horizon. During those quiet moments, Brian would often take my hand, his voice warm. "If you hadn't left that day, you'd probably be living a very different life right now." I thought about my parents, about Julia, about the cold, suffocating family dinners I had endured, but I had no regrets. I smiled, resting my head on his shoulder. "Maybe, but I've never felt this free before." Our happiness wasn't the kind of glittering perfection my mother had envisioned. It had struggles, exhausting days, and times when we had to figure things out together. But it was the happiness I had chosen. And for me, that was enough. The past came back like an unexpected storm on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon. I was sitting in Brian's small office, reviewing new contracts, when my phone rang. An unknown number. I frowned, hesitating for a few seconds before answering. "Hello." A woman's voice came through, hoarse, as if she had just been crying. "Claire, it's your mother." I froze. How long had it been since I last heard her voice? 3 years? Maybe 4? Since the day I walked out of that house, no one in my family had ever called or tried to find me. "Mom?" I asked, unease creeping in. "Claire, your father, he's in trouble." My grip on the phone tightened, my chest suddenly feeling heavy. I stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. "We need your help." I had imagined this moment many times, the day my parents would come back, not because they missed me, but because they needed something from me. I had never expected it to happen so soon. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. My mother took a shaky breath. "Your father, he's been accused of misconduct with a student. She filed a lawsuit and the media is making it worse. The university has suspended him. Claire, we've lost everything." I leaned back in my chair, staring blankly at my computer screen, my mind suddenly empty. My father? The man who always carried himself with authority, who never tolerated mistakes from anyone else, was now the center of a scandal? "And what do you want me to do?" I asked slowly. "We have no one else, Claire," my mother's voice cracked. "Julia and her husband cut ties with us the moment this came out. They even sold our apartment to avoid being involved. We have nowhere to go, no money for a lawyer. Claire, you're our only hope." I let out a cold, bitter laugh. "Your only hope?" My mother fell silent. "Did you forget what you told me the day I left? Dad said if I chose Brian I was no longer his daughter, and you turned your back on me. And now that everything has fallen apart, you want me to help?" "Claire," my mother's voice was pleading. "You're my daughter. How can you just turn away?" I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I had once thought that if this day ever came, I would feel some kind of satisfaction, seeing the people who cast me aside now struggling. But what I actually felt was nothing. I wasn't heartless, but I was no longer the naive girl who kept trying to please her parents. "Mom," I finally spoke, my voice calm but firm. "I once begged for your acceptance. Just once. But that never happened. And now, when you've lost everything, suddenly you remember me? Claire, please, we have no one else." "No," I said firmly. I heard my mother sobbing on the other end, but my decision didn't waver. "I wish you luck," I said before ending the call. I sat in silence for a few moments, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. But when I lifted my head, I saw Brian standing at the doorway, concern in his eyes. "Was it them?" he asked. I nodded. Brian stepped beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone. "Are you okay?" I looked at him and gave a small nod. For the first time in my life, I feel free. And that was the only answer I needed. 3 days after my mother's call, I saw them. I hadn't expected it. Since hanging up, I had convinced myself that this was over, but clearly my parents didn't think so. I was standing outside Brian's office, having just finished a meeting with a client, when an old silver car pulled up right in front of me. The door opened and the sight of the person stepping out made me freeze. My father. He still looked the same, but he was no longer the authoritative man he once was. His suit looked worn, his face thinner than before, and the pride in his eyes was gone. But his voice remained unchanged. still carrying the same rigid authority he had always used to command me. "Claire?" I instinctively stepped back. "What are you doing here?" Right behind him, my mother stepped out of the car. She looked even more exhausted, her eyes red and swollen, her hands clutching the fabric of her coat as if trying to steady herself. "Claire, my daughter." Her voice trembled, perhaps from emotion. I felt my chest tighten, but I held my ground. "I already told you on the phone, I can't help you." My father frowned, his sharp gaze filled with disbelief. "What did you just say?" "We are family. No one turns their back on their family in times of trouble." I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. I had thought about this moment before, but I never expected it to come so soon. "Family?" I scoffed. "Do you remember what you said the day I left? You told me that if I chose Brian, I was no longer your daughter." My mother opened her mouth as if to say something, but my father raised a hand to stop her. He stared at me, still trying to fit me back into the mold he had designed for me long ago. "Do you think this is some kind of childish rebellion? We raised you, educated you, and this is how you repay us?" I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Repay you," I emphasized each word. "You never gave me a choice. You mapped out my life as if it were an investment plan, and I was just another asset in your portfolio. I endured it for years, but did you ever stop to ask what I wanted?" My father said nothing, but his eyes remained hard. "I don't owe you anything," I continued, my voice unwavering. "You didn't raise me out of love. You raised me to meet your expectations, and when I didn't comply, you cast me aside like a failed investment. So why now, when everything is falling apart, do you suddenly think I'm obligated to help you?" My mother began to cry. "Claire, you can't be this heartless." I looked at her, a small part of me wanting to offer comfort, but I couldn't. If I gave in now, they would drag me back into the same cycle of control and guilt. "I'm not heartless," I said softly but firmly. "I've just learned how to protect myself." At that moment, I felt a warm hand rest on my shoulder. "Brian." He didn't need to ask what was happening. One look at the situation and he already understood. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice calm but protective. My father looked at Brian as if he were the most disgraceful person in the world. "It's you! You're the one who took Claire away from us." Brian didn't flinch. "No, Claire made that decision herself." My father clenched his jaw. "You think you can replace her family? That just because you gave her a roof over her head, she'll forget where she belongs?" I tightened my grip on Brian's hand. I was never meant to belong there. My father stared at me as if hoping I would change my mind, but I wasn't the weak girl he used to control anymore. After a long moment of tense silence, he exhaled sharply, then smirked. "You'll regret this." I simply shook my head. "No, Dad, I spent over 20 years regretting trying to please you. But since the day I walked out of that house, I haven't regretted a single moment." My father said nothing. Then, without another word, he turned and pulled my mother along with him. Before stepping into the car, my mother glanced back at me, her eyes filled with regret. But I knew it wasn't regret for me. It was regret for herself, for losing the daughter she thought she could control forever. As the car pulled away, I felt something deep inside me, finally, break free. Brian squeezed my hand, his eyes filled with pride. "Are you okay?" I took a deep breath and nodded. For the first time in my life, I truly feel free. 3 years later, I stood by the window, gazing out at the small garden behind our home. The golden hues of the late afternoon sun stretched across the grass, painting everything in a warm glow. In my arms, a tiny life slept peacefully, his gentle breaths warming the soft fabric of the blanket wrapped around him. My son, Ethan Anderson. His name was a powerful statement that I had moved forward into a new chapter of my life. A chapter where the past no longer held any control over me. Brian walked into the kitchen, still carrying the faint scent of metal and machinery after a long day of work. He stepped closer, gently placing a hand on my shoulder before leaning down to kiss our son's forehead. "How are my two favorite people today?" he asked, his voice warm and steady. I smiled, still in disbelief that this was my life. A life I had built with my own hands, not one that had been dictated to me. "Ethan has been great, but his mom is a little exhausted," I teased, though deep down I was filled with contentment. Brian chuckled, pulling me into his embrace. "I can help you get some rest." I rested my head against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of the heart that had carried me through so many hardships. We had been through so much. the struggles of building a life from scratch, the times Brian had to work far from home, the exhaustion of balancing work while preparing for our son's arrival. But none of it had ever made me waver. If anything, it only made me appreciate what we had even more. And most importantly, I had no regrets. After our last confrontation, they disappeared entirely from my life. No calls, no messages, not even a single word to check on me. I once thought I would feel empty without my family, but the truth was, I felt nothing at all. Perhaps that was the clearest sign that they had never truly been my family. Julia never reached out either. Maybe she had chosen to cut ties completely, or perhaps she was too busy maintaining her perfect image, distancing herself from anything that could tarnish her reputation. But I no longer cared. I had a real family, a husband who loved me, a child I would protect with everything I had, and a life I had chosen for myself. One late afternoon, as I sat on the swing in our yard, holding Ethan in my arms, Brian stepped outside, holding an old photograph. "I found this in one of your old boxes." I took it from him. A family picture from years ago, me, Julia, my parents all smiling. But my smile in that photo, it wasn't real. "Do you want to keep it?" Brian asked, his eyes filled with understanding. I stared at the picture for a long moment. Then, I smiled softly, flipped it over, and set it down on the table. "No need," I said calmly. Brian didn't ask any more questions, just gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. I didn't need to hold on to a part of the past that no longer mattered to me. I had chosen my own path. I had chosen my happiness. And most importantly, for the first time in my life, I knew without a doubt that I was no longer bound by outdated expectations. I was free, and I would live fully for the present and the future. For Ethan. For the family I had chosen. Claire's story is not just about finding freedom, it is a lesson in self-worth. The past can hold you back, but only if you allow it to control you. Claire had the courage to step out of her comfort zone and choose a path where she was in charge of her own destiny. Not everyone is born into a family that truly loves and supports them, but everyone has the right to create their own happiness. In life, sometimes we have to let go in order to move forward. And when we choose ourselves, that is the true meaning of freedom. What do you think about Claire's decision? Would you have done the same in her situation? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to follow the channel for more meaningful stories about life, family, and the choices that define us.